My phone started buzzing at 7:12 in the morning, and it did not stop. I was standing in my father's workshop in the same spot I had stood in 1,000 times as a boy, and the little screen on the workbench lit up over and over like something was on fire. I picked it up. 47 missed calls, 23 text messages, every single one of them from Linda, my wife of 31 years. I did not answer. A voicemail played on its own the way they do when the queue backs up. Her voice came out of the speaker thin and cracked, nothing like the voice I had woken up next to for 3 decades. "Michael, please, just answer me." I set the phone face down on the bench next to the can of wood glue and the rag I use for staining. Then I picked up a piece of sandpaper, folded it once over my knuckles, and went back to the rocking chair I had been building for my father since spring. My hand moved in slow, even strokes along the armrest. The wood was almost ready. It had taken me 4 months to get the curve right. 20 hours earlier, I would have answered that phone before the second ring. I would have dropped whatever I was holding. That is simply who I had been for 31 years, the husband who answered, the husband who fixed things, the husband who never once made her wait. But that was 20 hours ago. And a lot changes in 20 hours when you finally hear something you can no longer pretend you didn't hear. Let me take you back. Yesterday afternoon, I was standing in the break room at the plant where I've worked for almost 40 years, holding a cup of burnt coffee, half listening to a supervisor talk about a shipment that was running late. My phone rang. My father's name came up on the screen, Frank, 93. The only man in this world who calls me exactly twice a year unless something is wrong. I stepped into the hallway and answered, "Dad." There was a long pause, then breathing. Then water running somewhere behind him, and beneath all of it a voice so small I had to press the phone hard against my ear to catch it. "Son, I can't get up." I felt my whole body go still the way you go still when you step off a curb you didn't see. My wife was standing 3 feet away from me in that hallway. She had come to drop off my lunch, the one I'd forgotten that morning, and she was close enough to hear every word that came out of that phone. She heard my father whisper that he could not get up off his own bathroom floor. She looked at her tablet instead of at me, thumb still scrolling, and she said the sentence that ended something in our marriage before I even understood it was ending. "He can get up himself." I asked her again. I don't know why. Maybe I thought I'd misheard her the first time, the way you ask someone to repeat something terrible, hoping the second version will sound kinder. It didn't. "Call somebody else," she said, and went back to her screen. I looked at her for a moment. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. Something in me simply closed quiet and final, like a door pulled shut in another room. "Okay," I said. That was all. Just that one word. She has no idea even now what that word actually meant. My name is Michael Hensley. I am 63 years old. My father, Frank, is 93. And in all those years I have known him, I can count on one hand the number of times he has ever asked me for help. He built houses for a living the same way I build cabinets and furniture on the weekends, the same way his father laid brick before him. He has hands like old rope, thick and scarred, and even now, past 90, he still won't let me carry the trash cans to the curb without arguing about it first. "I've got 2 arms, Michael," he says. Last I checked, they still work. He lives alone in the farmhouse he and my mother bought in 1968, a small white house at the end of a gravel road with a porch that leans slightly to the left and a barn out back that hasn't held an animal in 20 years. My mother passed when I was 34. He never remarried. He never even dated, as far as I know. He just kept living in that house, fixing what broke, mowing what grew, and asking nothing of anyone. Every evening after my shift at the plant, I drive the 11 miles out to see him. It started as a habit after my mother died, just to make sure he was eating, and it never stopped. 30 years of evenings. I bring him the newspaper he refuses to read online. I sit with him on the porch while he tells me the same 3 stories about the war, about the flood of '72, about the summer he built our kitchen table with his bare hands in a single week because my mother wanted one before Christmas. He has fallen twice in the past 2 years. Small things. A stumble on the porch step, a slip getting out of the truck. Both times he brushed it off before I even finished asking if he was hurt. "I'm fine," he'd say. "Don't fuss." I have asked him more than once to consider assisted living somewhere, with people around somewhere, with a nurse on call. He always gives me the same look, the one that ends the conversation before it starts. I built this house with my own 2 hands, son. I intend to die in it, not in some building full of strangers where they call bingo over a loudspeaker. I never push it. Some men need their independence the way other men need air, and my father is one of them. I respect that more than I could ever explain to someone who didn't grow up watching him work. Linda used to come with me on those evening visits. In the early years, she'd bring him a plate of something she'd made, sit across from him at the kitchen table, laugh at his stories the same as I did. I remember her holding his hand once at my mother's funeral, telling him she'd always look after him, that he wasn't going to be alone in this. I believed her. I had no reason not to. But something shifted slowly over the years. I couldn't tell you the exact day it started. It wasn't one big moment. It was smaller than that, the kind of change you only see if you look back at 10 years all at once, instead of one day at a time. She stopped coming on the drives out to the farmhouse. She'd sigh when I mentioned I was heading over there, the way you sigh at a chore you're tired of hearing about. When his birthday came around last year, she forgot it entirely, and when I reminded her, she just shrugged and said, "He's 92, Michael. I'm sure he doesn't keep count anymore." He kept count. He always keeps count. She complained about the groceries I picked up for him twice a month, said we were subsidizing a grown man who refuses to move somewhere sensible. She said it in front of him once at Thanksgiving, thinking he wouldn't hear her from the kitchen. He heard every word. He never said anything about it. He just quietly stopped joining us for holidays after that, always with some excuse about his knee or the weather. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself she was tired that elder care wears on people who didn't grow up close to their own parents the way I did. I told myself more times than I want to admit that she would come around. She never did. I know that now. I didn't know it yet, standing in that hallway with a coffee going cold in my hand. But 3 days ago, my father called me for the first time in months. He never calls unless something is wrong. The break room at the plant smells like burnt coffee and the inside of a microwave that never gets cleaned. I was standing near the window, half listening to Ray from the loading dock complain about a shipment stuck somewhere outside Toledo, when my phone rang in my pocket. I saw my father's name on the screen and felt that small tug of surprise I always feel when he calls. Frank doesn't call. Frank shows up, or he waits for me to show up, but he does not reach out first unless the world has tilted in some direction he can't fix on his own. I stepped into the hallway away from the noise of the break room and answered. "Dad?" Nothing at first. Just a long silence, and somewhere behind it the faint hiss of water running. Not a shower spray. Something steadier, more constant, a faucet left on maybe, or a pipe. I pressed the phone tighter against my ear. "Dad, you there?" Then I heard him breathe. It wasn't his normal breath, the slow, even breath of a man who has outlived most of his generation through sheer stubbornness. It was shallow, uneven, like each breath cost him something. "Son," he said. His voice came out so quiet I had to close my eyes just to hear it clearly. "I can't get up." I felt the hallway tilt slightly under my feet. "Dad, where are you?" "What happened?" "Bathroom floor," he said. "Slipped getting out of the shower. Must have been lying here a while." "How long, Dad? How long have you been down?" A pause. I could hear him trying to work it out the way a man works out a math problem his mind doesn't want to solve. "Don't rightly know. Water's still running?" I couldn't reach to shut it off. My chest went tight. I have never in my life heard my father sound the way he sounded in that moment, small and cold, and ashamed of being small and cold. "Dad, listen to me. Don't move. I'm calling for help right now, okay? Just stay still." "I'm fine," he said out of pure habit, the same 3 words he's said after every fall for the last 2 years. But this time the words came out cracked in the middle like a board that's been carrying too much weight for too long. That was when I saw Linda. She had walked into the plant a few minutes earlier to drop off the lunch I'd left on the kitchen counter, that morning turkey sandwich, the same one I take every day. She was standing a few feet away in the hallway, scrolling through something on her tablet, close enough to hear every word I was saying into the phone. I looked at her. I mouthed the word "Dad," and then fell, hoping she would understand, without me having to explain twice. Hoping some old instinct in her, some leftover piece of the woman who once held his hand at my mother's funeral, would kick in. "Linda," I said, pulling the phone slightly away from my mouth but not ending the call. "You're 5 minutes from his place. Can you go check on him? Please, right now. She didn't look up. Her thumb kept moving across the screen. He can get up himself. I stood there for a second, certain I had misheard her. The plant around me kept humming forklifts machinery, a radio playing somewhere down the line, and none of it seemed real anymore. Everything had narrowed down to that one hallway, that one sentence, and my father's ragged breathing still coming through the phone against my ear. Linda, I said again, slower this time. He's on the bathroom floor. He can't get up. I need you to go check on him. She finally looked at me then. Not with worry, not even with irritation exactly. Just a flat, tired look, the look of someone being asked to do a chore they've decided somewhere deep down they are simply done doing. Call somebody else, she said, and went back to her tablet. I want to tell you I argued. I want to tell you I raised my voice, that I said something about 31 years of marriage and the man who held her hand at our wedding and told her he'd love her like his own daughter. But I didn't. Something in me just went quiet instead. The way a room goes quiet when the power cuts out, not dark all at once, but dimming, fading until there's nothing left but the shape of what used to be lit. Okay, I said, not to her. To him mostly, though. I'm not sure he even heard it clearly through the pain. I hung up on nothing. There was no one left to argue with. I put the sandwich down on the break room table, still wrapped in its foil untouched. I told my supervisor I had a family emergency, and I walked out to my truck without saying another word to my wife, who stood there in the hallway already scrolling again, already moving on to whatever came next in her day. She had no idea I wasn't moving on to anything. I was moving toward something. Toward my father alone on cold tile, whispering into a phone, because that was the only strength he had left. The drive out to my father's farmhouse takes 22 minutes on a normal day. That afternoon it felt like 2 hours. I called 911 first, my hands steadier than I expected, as I gave the dispatcher the same address I'd known my whole life. Then I called Ed Callahan, the neighbor, 2 properties down, a retired mailman who has kept an eye on my father since my mother passed. No answer. I called Ruth Simmons across the road. No answer either. It was the middle of a weekday, and the gravel road my father lives on is quiet enough that half the houses sit empty until evening. So I drove. Both hands on the wheel, eyes on the road, and somewhere underneath all of it, my mind doing the thing minds do when there's nothing left to control, building the worst version of what I might find, then tearing it down, then building it again a little worse each time. I thought about how long the water had been running. I thought about how cold that bathroom tile gets even in summer, how thin his skin has become these last few years, how a man his age can go from fine to gone faster than anyone wants to admit. I gripped the wheel so hard my knuckles went pale, and I made myself breathe slow the way he taught me to breathe when I was 9 years old, and panicking halfway up a ladder he'd sent me to clean the gutters from. Slow down, son. Panic doesn't fix anything. It just makes the fall worse. I passed the turn for the plant. I passed the diner where he and I have eaten breakfast every Sunday for as long as I can remember. I passed the church where they held my mother's funeral, and for one strange second I thought about how close I might be to needing it again for him. When I finally pulled into the gravel drive, the ambulance was already there, lights turning silently in the afternoon sun. No siren, just that slow red and white pulse against the white paint of the house. I was out of the truck before it had fully stopped rolling. I found him in the hallway just outside the bathroom on a stretcher, a paramedic crouched beside him, checking his pulse. He was conscious. His skin had a grayish tint I had never seen on him before, and his lips were dry and cracked, and when he saw me come through the door, something in his face folded in on itself. "Sorry to bother you," he said. 4 words. That was all he said to me, and it undid something in my chest that I don't think will ever fully go back together. 93 years old, lying on a stretcher after God knows how many hours on a bathroom floor. And the first thing out of his mouth was an apology for being a burden. "Dad." I knelt down next to him, took his hand in mine. It was cold, colder than I'd ever felt it, even in the dead of winter working outside with him as a boy. "You don't ever apologize to me. You hear me, not ever." He tried to smile. It came out crooked, more grimace than smile, but I understood it for what it was. The paramedics said no broken bones, which felt like the first mercy of the day, but his blood pressure was low, his skin was cool and dry in a way that worried them, and they wanted him at the hospital immediately for fluids and observation. I rode in the back of the ambulance holding his hand the whole way, watching the machines beep steadily beside him, watching a man who built houses with his own two hands look smaller than I had ever seen him look in 63 years of knowing him. At the hospital, they move fast. IV fluids blood work, a doctor who spoke in the calm, careful tone doctors use when they're trying not to alarm you and failing anyway. Severe dehydration, she said. His kidney function had dipped low enough to concern her. They would need to keep him overnight, possibly longer, depending on how he responded to the fluids. I asked her the question I didn't want to ask. How close was close? She hesitated for just a second, the kind of hesitation that tells you more than words ever could. At his age, with this level of dehydration, a few more hours on that floor and… She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. I sat down in the plastic chair beside his hospital bed, and I did not move for a long time, watching the fluids drip slowly into his arm, watching his chest rise and fall, counting each breath like it was something I could hold on to. I did not call Linda. Not once. Not to tell her where I was, not to tell her he was alive. Somewhere in that quiet hospital room, sitting beside my father while he slept, I understood that I had already answered the only question that mattered. She had made her choice standing in that hallway at the plant. Now I was making mine sitting in this one. Hospitals have a way of slowing time down until it almost stops. I sat in that plastic chair for hours, listening to the soft, steady beep of the monitor beside my father's bed. And somewhere in that stillness, my mind started doing something it hadn't let itself do in years. It started remembering. Not the big moments, not the arguments because there had barely been any. It was the small ones that came back to me one after another, quiet and undeniable, the way water finds every crack in a foundation before the whole thing finally gives. I remembered Linda rolling her eyes 3 Christmases ago when I mentioned I wanted to invite my father to spend the holiday with us instead of alone in that farmhouse. He never wants to come anyway, she'd said, which wasn't true. He always came when I asked him directly. It was Linda who stopped asking. I remembered his birthday last spring, the one she forgot entirely. I'd reminded her that morning, and she'd shrugged over her coffee and said, "He's 92, Michael. I'm sure he doesn't keep count anymore," in a tone that made it sound like his age was an inconvenience rather than a life. I remembered the groceries. Twice a month, I drove to the store and picked up the things he needed: his blood pressure medication, the soft bread he can chew easily now that his teeth aren't what they used to be, the decaf coffee he switched to after his last checkup. Small things. Maybe $80 a month, if that. Linda had brought it up at dinner once in front of him, not realizing, or maybe not caring, that he could hear every word from the next room. We're basically subsidizing a grown man who refuses to move somewhere sensible, she'd said, cutting into her chicken like the conversation cost her nothing. I remembered the silence that followed. I remembered my father excusing himself early that night, saying his knee was bothering him, though I'd watched him walk fine all evening. He never joined us for another holiday dinner after that. Not Thanksgiving, not Christmas. Always some excuse: the weather, his knee, a headache. And I had let him give me those excuses instead of asking the real question, because some part of me already knew the real answer and didn't want to hear it out loud. She called me a burden in front of my son. I never asked him if that's what he heard that night. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself Linda was tired, that she hadn't grown up close to her own parents the way I had grown up close to mine, that caregiving simply wore differently on people who didn't understand it from the inside. I told myself more times than I can count that she would come around, that underneath the impatience was still the same woman who had held my father's hand at my mother's funeral and promised him he wouldn't be alone. Sitting in that hospital chair, watching fluid drip slowly into my father's arm, I understood something I had spent years refusing to understand. She never came around because she had never intended to. What I had called patience all those years had actually been permission. Every time I let a small cruelty pass without naming it, I had been teaching her that it was allowed. I looked at my father's hand resting on the blanket, the same hand that had built our kitchen table in a single week, because my mother wanted one before Christmas, the same hand that had taught me to hold a hammer to check a level, to never trust a house you hadn't inspected yourself. That hand had spent 93 years giving. It had never once, not in all my life, asked to receive. And today, when it finally reached for help, the only person close enough to answer had chosen not to. My father stirred slightly in his sleep, his brow tightening for a moment before smoothing again. I reached over and adjusted the blanket at his shoulder, the way he used to adjust mine when I was small, and pretending to be asleep on the car ride home from somewhere far. "I see it now, Dad," I said quietly to a man who couldn't hear me in a room lit only by the pale glow of the monitor. I should have seen it a long time ago. He didn't stir again, but somewhere in the stillness of that room, something in me finally fully woke up. He woke a little after 9 that night, his color better, his eyes clearer than they'd been in the ambulance. The nurse said the fluids were working, that his numbers were improving, that if the trend held, he might be able to go home in a day or two under close watch. I pulled my chair closer to the bed and took his hand again, and for a while neither of us said anything at all. We just sat there the way we used to sit on his porch in the evenings, comfortable in the quiet. "You scared me today, Dad," I finally said. He turned his head toward me slowly. Scared myself too, if I'm honest. I hesitated, turning something over in my mind before I let it out. "Has this happened before the falling, I mean? More than the 2 times you told me about?" He didn't answer right away. His eyes drifted toward the window, toward the dark parking lot outside, and I watched something pass across his face. Not pain exactly, but the particular weariness of a man deciding whether a secret is still worth keeping. "There were a few others," he said finally. "Small ones. Nothing like today." "Why didn't you tell me?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Didn't want to trouble you, son. You got enough on your plate." "Dad," I leaned forward, "you almost died today. I need you to tell me the truth." He sighed, and in that sigh I heard 93 years of a man who had never once let himself be a burden to anyone. "There was one, maybe 8 months back. Slipped in the kitchen. Wasn't hurt bad, just shook up. I called your house." Something cold moved through my chest. "You called the house, I never got a call." "Didn't call you," he said quietly. "Linda picked up. Told her I'd taken a little fall, wondered if she could swing by just to check I was steady on my feet." He paused. "She said she was running late for something, that she'd have you call me when you got home." "I never got a message, Dad." "I know that now." His hand tightened faintly around mine. "Figured she forgot and all the running around people do these days. Didn't think much of it at the time. Got myself up eventually. Made it to a chair. Sat there a good while before my legs felt right again. I sat back in the chair feeling something settle heavy in my stomach, something between grief and a kind of quiet fury I wasn't used to carrying. "Why didn't you say something to me after any of the times?" He looked at me then, and there was nothing cloudy in his eyes at all, nothing of the confusion that sometimes comes with age. There was only a clear, deliberate kind of love, the kind that costs something to give. "Because I didn't want to be the reason for trouble between you two," he said simply. "A marriage is a hard thing to build, son. I watched your mother and me build ours for 41 years, brick by brick, same as any house. I wasn't going to be the one who came along near the end of my life and knocked a hole in yours. Figured whatever wasn't right between you and Linda, that was your business to work out in your own time. Not mine to stir up." I felt something crack open in my chest, wide and raw. My father, 93 years old, alone in that farmhouse, falling in his own kitchen, and lying there until his legs came back to him, had chosen again and again to protect a marriage that wasn't even protecting him. "You shouldn't have had to carry that alone, Dad." "Wasn't carrying anything I couldn't handle," he said, though his voice had gone thinner than I liked. "Man my age learns to carry quiet things. Learned it a long time ago, before you were even born." I thought of my mother then, of the years she spent by his side, of the quiet steadiness that had run through their whole marriage like a load-bearing wall. I thought about how much of that steadiness he had passed down to me, and how I had spent 31 years mistaking someone else's coldness for something I could warm with enough patience. "I'm not going to let that happen again," I said. "Not to you, not ever again." He studied my face for a long moment, the way he used to study a foundation before deciding whether it would hold a house. "I believe you, son," he said quietly. "I always have." Outside the window, the hospital parking lot lights buzzed faintly in the dark, and somewhere back at the house, an unfinished rocking chair sat waiting in my father's workshop. One armrest still rough beneath the sandpaper, still waiting for the last few strokes that would finally make it smooth. They kept him 3 more days. By the time they released him, his numbers had climbed back where they belonged, and the color had returned to his face. though something in his eyes had changed a wariness that hadn't been there before, the wariness of a man who has looked closely at how alone he really was. I took 2 weeks off from the plant to stay with him at the farmhouse, sleeping in my old childhood bedroom down the hall, cooking his meals, making sure he never had to reach for anything on his own. I told Linda none of it. She had called my cell a handful of times that first week, not 47 times, yet not close to it, just enough to remind me she existed, and each time I let it ring out. I wasn't punishing her. I simply had nothing left to say into a phone that had already failed my father once. On the fourth day, while Frank napped in his recliner by the window, I decided to clean out the small office off the back hallway, a room he'd used for decades to keep his paperwork, tax records, receipts from jobs he'd worked 50 years ago, letters from men he'd served with who were mostly gone now. It needed airing out, and honestly, I needed something to do with my hands that wasn't waiting. I went through drawer after drawer, sorting what could be thrown away from what he'd want kept, when I found a folder tucked behind an old set of blueprints for a barn he'd built in 1979. It was thick, bound with a rubber band, gone brittle with age, and the tab on the front was labeled in his neat, blocky handwriting. Michael House, 1985. I sat down slowly at his desk and opened it. Inside were canceled checks yellowed with time, each one made out to a bank I recognized instantly, the same bank that had financed the house Linda and I bought when we were newlyweds 31 years ago, back when I was 29 years old, with a decent job at the plant and not nearly enough saved for a down payment. I remembered that year clearly. I remembered sitting across from a loan officer, humiliated, watching him explain that we were about $4,000 short of qualifying. I remembered going home and telling my father, not asking for anything, just venting the way sons do to fathers when they don't know what else to do with disappointment. 2 weeks later, the loan went through. I had always believed it was some quirk of paperwork, some adjustment on the bank's side, maybe a co-signer arrangement my father had quietly worked out with a friend at the bank he knew from church. I never asked too many questions. I was 29 and desperate to move into a home of my own, and when things suddenly worked out, I didn't look too closely at why. Now I understood why. $4,100 paid directly to the bank on my behalf, dated 3 days before our closing. Beneath the canceled checks was a loan agreement drafted in careful formal language between Frank Hensley and Michael Hensley, outlining a personal loan of $4,100 to be repaid at my convenience with no interest, no deadline, no pressure of any kind. I recognized my own signature at the bottom. I remembered signing something for him once early in our marriage, though he had waved off my questions at the time, told me it was just for the records, nothing to fuss over. I had tried to pay him back over the years more than once. He always refused. Keep your money, son. Buy your family something nice instead. I had assumed all this time that he simply meant it as a gift and preferred not to make a formal thing of it, but here it was, documented, organized. Every payment I'd ever tried to make toward it, and every time he'd quietly returned the check to me, folded inside a birthday card, was recorded in his neat handwriting on a separate sheet along with dates and small notes. Michael tried again, sent it back. Told him buy Linda something for the baby instead. There were letters too, several of them written to himself more than to anyone else. The kind of letters a careful man writes when he wants a record to outlast his own memory. One dated almost 10 years ago caught my eye more than the rest. If anything should happen to me and questions arise about the down payment on Michael's house, this folder should answer them. I never wanted Linda to feel indebted to me or to feel the house wasn't truly theirs. That is why I never told her. But a man should keep his records straight, whatever else happens. I sat there for a long time with that folder open in my lap, the afternoon light slanting low through the office window, and I understood something with a clarity that felt almost physical. My father had quietly funded the foundation of my entire adult life, and never once used it as leverage, never once mentioned it to Linda. In all those years, she had grown colder and colder toward him, never once reminded either of us what he had given. He had simply kept the paperwork straight, because that was who he was. I heard the recliner creak down the hall, the sound of him stirring from his nap, and I closed the folder gently and set it back exactly where I had found it. But something in me had shifted, quiet and permanent, the way a house settles differently after you finally understand what's holding it up. I went home on the 6th day just to collect more clothes and check the mail, leaving my father in the capable hands of Ruth Simmons, who had finally answered her phone and promised to sit with him through the afternoon. I hadn't planned on staying long. I hadn't planned on finding what I found either. The house was quiet when I walked in Linda's car, gone from the driveway, which wasn't unusual for a weekday afternoon. I went upstairs to grab a few more shirts, and it was on the kitchen counter of all places that I saw the folder sitting open next to her laptop, glossy printouts, comparable home listings, a business card from a realty office 3 towns over. Sandra Whitfield, Whitfield Premier Realty, specializing in relocation and downsizing. I stood there for a moment looking at printouts of homes in Scottsdale, Arizona. Single-story ranch houses with desert landscaping, swimming pools, HOA fees, listed neatly beside square footage. One had a yellow sticky note attached to the corner in Linda's handwriting. This one has the guest casita, perfect for visits, not for permanent stays. I read that note 3 times before I understood what it meant, and once I understood it, I couldn't unsee it. She wasn't planning a vacation home. She was planning our future, and in that future, whatever room existed for my father was small, temporary, and clearly marked with a boundary meant to keep him from ever truly living with us. I heard her key in the front door 20 minutes later. She came in still in her work clothes, tired the way she always was on Thursdays, and stopped short when she saw me sitting at the kitchen table with the folder open in front of me. "Michael," she set her purse down slowly. "I didn't know you were coming by today." "I live here too, Linda. Or I did last I checked." She didn't answer that. Instead, her eyes moved to the folder, and something in her face rearranged itself quickly into a kind of practiced calm. "Okay, I was going to talk to you about this eventually. I just wanted to have the information ready first." "Talk to me about selling our house, moving to Arizona," without saying a word to me. "I was gathering information," she said again, sitting across from me now, folding her hands the way she does when she's about to make an argument she's rehearsed. "You've been consumed with your father this whole week. I figured someone needed to start thinking about our future." "He almost died, Linda." "I know that." Her voice softened just slightly, just enough to sound convincing. "And I feel terrible about how that day went." "I do. But Michael, be honest with yourself. He's 93 years old. This is only going to get harder from here. Falls hospital visits needing more and more care. We can't keep our whole life on hold waiting for the next emergency. So your solution was to sell our house and move 2,000 miles away." "My solution," she said, leaning forward, "was to finally put us first for once. You'll eventually have to put him somewhere that can actually take care of him. You know that, even if you won't say it out loud. Once that happens, there's nothing keeping us here. We could have the retirement we've talked about for years. Somewhere warm, somewhere just for us." I looked at her for a long moment. This woman I had built a life with, who was already imagining a future with my father, reduced to a line item, a problem eventually solved and then forgotten. I thought about the folder in his office, 40 years old, full of quiet sacrifice she had never once known about, and would never think to thank him for. I thought about her voice in that hallway at the plant. "He can get up himself." She slid a document across the table toward me, a listing agreement already partially filled out, waiting only for my signature beside hers. "I just need you to sign this so Sandra can list the house. That's all. We can talk about everything else after." I looked down at the paper. My name printed neatly at the bottom, a blank line, waiting for my signature right next to hers, already signed in her looping handwriting, dated 3 days earlier, 3 days before my father had even come home from the hospital. I did not sign it. I did not push it away either. I simply closed the folder over it, slow and deliberate, and stood up from the table. "I'll think about it," I said. She smiled, then small and satisfied, the smile of someone who has already decided how a conversation is going to end before it's over. "That's all I'm asking. Just think about it." I drove back out to my father's farmhouse that evening without another word between us. Linda watched me go from the front window, and I understood even then that she believed my silence meant she had already won. She had mistaken it for surrender. She had no idea it was something else entirely, something closer to the calm that settles over a man right before he finally decides what he's going to do. I hadn't told my father about the folder on Linda's kitchen counter. I hadn't told him about the printouts of desert ranch houses, or the sticky note about the guest casita, or the listing agreement already signed in her looping handwriting. I had planned to keep it from him a while longer at least, until he was fully back on his feet, at least until I'd found some gentler way to say it. He already knew. I found this out on a quiet Tuesday morning about 10 days after he'd come home from the hospital. I was in the kitchen making his eggs the way he likes them, soft in the middle, and he shuffled in slower than usual, dressed not in his usual flannel and work pants, but in a collared shirt and the gray slacks he only wears to church or to the bank. "Got an appointment this morning," he said, settling into his chair at the table. "Wondered if you'd drive me." "Sure, Dad. Where to?" "Sullivan's office. Attorney over on Main." I set the plate of eggs down in front of him, studying his face. "Everything all right?" He was quiet for a moment, cutting into his eggs with the same careful, deliberate motion he'd used my whole life, whether he was building a house frame or simply eating breakfast. "Ruth mentioned something to me the other day. Said she'd heard through her sister, who cuts hair over at the place on 5th, that Linda's been talking to a realtor. Talking about Arizona." He looked up at me. "That true?" I set down the pan I'd been holding, feeling something tighten in my chest. "It's true, Dad. I found the paperwork myself. She wants to sell the house, move out west. She's already got the listing agreement drawn up." He nodded slowly, like a man confirming something he'd already suspected, rather than hearing it for the first time. "And what's her plan for me in all this?" I hesitated. There was no gentle way to say it, and my father has never once in 93 years thanked me for softening a hard truth. "There's a house she likes with a guest casita," I said. "She wrote on the listing that it's for visits, not for staying." He didn't flinch. He simply nodded again, slower this time, and went back to his eggs, chewing thoughtfully, the way he chews everything now, careful and unhurried. "Figured as much," he said finally. "Woman's had that look about her for years. The look of someone counting down to something." "I'm sorry, Dad. Nothing for you to be sorry for." He set his fork down and looked at me steadily. "You didn't marry her cold, son. People change slow, a little at a time, and by the time you notice, you've already forgiven 100 small things without meaning to. That's not weakness. That's just being human. But I've had 93 years to learn something you're still learning, and I intend to use it." That's how I ended up sitting in the waiting room of Sullivan and Associates that morning, flipping through a magazine I wasn't reading, while my father sat behind a closed office door with a lawyer he'd known for 30 years. I don't know everything that was said in that room. He never told me the details that day, and I never asked. But I know what came out of it because I watched the changes unfold in the weeks that followed. He updated his will. He established a trust, not some hasty, angry document scratched out in a fit of spite, but something careful and considered, the kind of thing a man builds the same way he builds a house, with a level in one hand and patience in the other. The farmhouse. The small parcel of land behind the barn he'd been renting out to a neighbor for corn the last decade. The modest but steady savings he'd built over a lifetime of work. All of it restructured, protected, placed beyond the reach of any hand that hadn't earned the right to touch it. He also did something I didn't expect. He had Sullivan draft a formal record, plain, unemotional, undeniable, documenting every dollar he had ever given toward my house. My education, the truck I drove, going all the way back to that folder I'd found behind the old barn blueprints. Not to punish anyone, not out of spite. Simply, as he put it later, so there's no confusion about whose foundation this family's standing on. When we left the office that afternoon, he was quiet in the passenger seat for most of the drive home, watching the fields pass by the window, the same fields he'd watched his whole life. "You mad at me for doing this?" he asked, finally, not looking at me. "No, Dad." I meant it. "I should have protected you a long time ago. I'm glad you did it yourself." He nodded, satisfied, and was quiet again for a long moment before he spoke. "I didn't do this out of anger, son," he said. "Want you to understand that. I've never been an angry man, and I'm not fixing to start now, 93 years old. I did it because a man's got to protect what he spent a lifetime building, even the parts nobody can see." He turned to look at me, then his eyes steady, the same eyes that had watched over me my whole life. "Kindness isn't weakness, Michael. People mistake it for that all the time. But sometimes kindness just waits longer than folks expect it to. Waits for the right moment. That's all I did today. I waited long enough." I didn't say anything back. I didn't need to. We drove the rest of the way home in the kind of silence that says more than words ever could, past the church, past the diner, past the turn for the plant, until the farmhouse came into view at the end of the gravel road, standing exactly where it had always stood, steady, unmoved, and finally fully his again. I stayed at the farmhouse through the rest of that week and into the next, helping my father settle back into his routine, watching him grow steadier on his feet with each passing day. I went home only when I needed to, careful and businesslike, saying little, giving Linda nothing to hold on to. She asked twice more about the listing agreement. Both times I told her the same thing. I'm still thinking about it. She didn't push harder than that. I think looking back, she'd already convinced herself the outcome was inevitable, that my silence was simply the last formality standing between her and Scottsdale. She kept meeting with Sandra Whitfield. She kept sending me links to homes she liked, texts with little heart emojis next to photos of swimming pools and desert sunsets, as if she were building a life around a decision I had never actually made. I was in my father's workshop, back to sanding the last rough patch on the rocking chair's armrest, when Sullivan called. Frank's attorney's office called mine, one attorney's paralegal ringing another's, a chain of quiet, careful phone calls that had been set in motion the moment my father signed his name at the bottom of that trust. I don't know exactly when Sullivan's office reached out to Linda directly, only that it happened and that whatever conversation took place on her end, it was enough to finally rattle the calm she'd been carrying for weeks. I know all this now only because of what came next. At 7:12 the following morning, standing in that same workshop with sandpaper folded over my knuckles, my phone began buzzing on the workbench and did not stop. 47 missed calls by the time I finally looked. 23 texts, each one shorter and more frantic than the last. Michael called me. Michael, this isn't funny. What did you do? Please, just call me back. I know now what she'd learned that morning, piece by piece, the way a wall comes down when you finally understand which beam was holding it up. The listing had been withdrawn. Sandra Whitfield, apologetic and confused, had called to say the paperwork Michael's father's attorney had filed made the timing complicated, and she'd rather wait until things settled. The trust, once she finally understood what it meant, made it clear that the down payment on our own house, the truck in our driveway, even a portion of the equity we'd built over 3 decades, had roots reaching back to a folder in a farmhouse office she had never known existed and had spent years dismissing as unnecessary charity toward a grown man who refuses to move somewhere sensible. Every plan she had quietly built brick by brick over the past several weeks had come apart overnight, not through anger, not through a single raised voice, but through paperwork drawn up calmly by a 93-year-old man who had simply decided finally to protect what was his. I listened to the voicemail once standing there in the workshop, my father's unfinished rocking chair beneath my hand. Michael, her voice said, thin and cracked in a way I had never heard from her before. Please, just answer me. I thought about another voice, smaller and thinner, still whispering through a phone in a hospital hallway 3 weeks earlier. Son, I can't get up. I thought about her answer to that voice delivered without even looking up from her screen. He can get up himself. I set the phone face down on the bench exactly as I had the first time and picked up the sandpaper again. My father shuffled in a few minutes later, drawn by the buzzing he could hear even from the kitchen, and stood in the doorway watching me work. That's her, I take it, he said. That's her. He nodded slowly, watching my hand move in even strokes along the wood. You gonna answer? I set the sandpaper down and looked at the chair, at the curve of the armrest, finally smooth beneath my palm after 4 months of careful work. I thought about all the years I had answered before the second ring, all the years I had mistaken patience for love and silence for peace, all the years my father had carried his own falls alone, rather than disturb the fragile thing I had convinced myself was a marriage. Not yet, I said. My father almost smiled, then the same crooked, careful smile from his hospital bed, and settled into the chair across from the workbench to watch me finish what I'd started. The phone buzzed once more against the wood and went quiet. Sullivan's office sat on the second floor of an old brick building on Main Street, above a hardware store that had been there since before I was born. I drove Linda there myself 2 days after the 47 calls, the two of us sitting in a silence so heavy it seemed to have its own weight in the car, neither of us reaching for the radio. She had asked for this meeting, not me, not my father. She had called Sullivan's office directly, her voice, according to his paralegal somewhere, between confused and pleading, insisting there had been some kind of mistake, some misunderstanding that needed to be cleared up before things went any further. My father was already seated at the small conference table when we arrived, dressed again in his collared shirt, hands folded calmly in front of him. Sullivan sat beside him with a folder open on the table, the same careful, organized kind of folder my father had always kept thick with papers tabbed and dated. Linda sat down across from them. I sat beside her close enough to be present far enough to make clear I wasn't there to speak on her behalf. "Mr. Hensley," Sullivan said, addressing her with the same even professional tone he probably used for every difficult conversation in that office. "Thank you for coming in. I understand there are some questions about the recent changes to Frank's estate." "I don't understand why this is happening," Linda said, and I could hear underneath the practiced calm she was trying to hold on to something close to real fear. "We've never had any problems before. Why now? Why like this out of nowhere?" Sullivan glanced at my father, who gave a small, unhurried nod. "It isn't out of nowhere," Sullivan said. He slid the first document across the table, the canceled checks from 1985 copied clean and clear. "This is the record of the down payment Frank contributed toward Michael's first home. $4,100 paid directly to the bank." Linda stared at the paper. "That was almost 40 years ago. You were never told," Sullivan said simply. "That was Frank's choice made at the time, and he's never regretted it. But it means the foundation of the home you and Michael have lived in for 3 decades was never entirely built on your own resources alone." He slid another paper forward. "This is the trust Frank established 2 weeks ago, which restructures how that contribution, along with several others made over the years, is legally recognized going forward." He laid out the rest without raising his voice, without a hint of triumph in his tone. The truck loan Frank had quietly co-signed years ago and paid down without ever mentioning it, a portion of home improvements from a decade back, small threads of generosity that had been woven so seamlessly into our life that neither Linda nor I had ever noticed the pattern until it was laid out flat on a conference table, undeniable. "None of this changes what you and Michael legally own together," Sullivan said. "But it does mean that any future transaction involving that property, a sale, a refinance, anything requiring a clear accounting of its origins, will need to account for Frank's documented contribution and the terms of the trust protecting it, which put plainly means the house cannot be sold or listed without his awareness and consent going forward." Linda's face had gone pale. "This is insane. You can't just do this because I didn't run to check on him one time." "It wasn't one time," I said quietly. "It was the first thing I'd said since we sat down. He told me about the fall 8 months ago, too. The one you answered and never mentioned to me." Something flickered across her face, not quite guilt, but close to it, close enough that she looked away from me, toward the window instead. "I want to be clear about something," my father said then, speaking for the first time since we'd sat down, his voice steady and unhurried, carrying none of the anger I might have expected, and none of the weakness either. "This isn't punishment, Linda. I've got no interest in punishing anybody at 93 years old. I've just got an interest in protecting what I spent a lifetime building, same as any man would. You made your choice that day at the plant. I'm making mine now. That's all this is." Linda didn't answer him. She sat very still, looking down at the documents spread across the table, at 4 decades of quiet generosity laid bare in black and white, at a truth she had never once thought to look for, because she had never once thought my father worth the looking. Sullivan closed his folder gently. "I think that covers what we needed to discuss today." The room went quiet, the kind of quiet that follows a door finally closing on something that can't be reopened. Linda gathered the papers with trembling hands, not because anyone had raised a voice at her, not because anyone had called her cruel or selfish or anything at all, simply because the facts laid out plainly on a table had done what no argument ever could. They had shown her exactly what she had never bothered to see. She waited until we were back in the car to fall apart. I hadn't even pulled out of the parking lot behind Sullivan's building before the sound started, not loud, not dramatic, just a thin, cracked breath that turned into something closer to weeping. Her hands pressed against her face, her shoulders curling inward the way they do when a person finally runs out of places to hide from themselves. "Michael, I'm so sorry." she said, the words coming out broken between breaths. I don't know what happened to me. I don't know when I became someone who could say that to you about your own father. I keep thinking about it that whole day, and I don't even recognize myself. I sat there with my hands on the wheel, the engine idling, not yet ready to drive. I'll call him, she said. I'll apologize to his face. I'll do whatever it takes to fix this, Michael, please. I know I don't deserve it, but please, don't let this be the end of everything we built. I let the silence sit for a while before I answered. Not out of cruelty, not to make her wait and suffer the way she'd once made my father wait on cold tile. I let it sit because some things need space around them to be heard clearly, and I had spent 31 years rushing to fill silences that maybe should have been left alone. You want to know what I keep thinking about? I finally said, my voice quiet, steady, nothing like the anger I might have expected from myself a month ago. I keep thinking about how you didn't even look up from your phone. Not once. My father was on a bathroom floor and I was standing right in front of you, and you never once lifted your eyes off that screen. Michael, let me finish. I wasn't raising my voice. I didn't need to. Yesterday, my father whispered because he couldn't stand. Today you're crying because your plans can't. I turned to look at her then, and I felt something in my chest that was neither triumph nor rage, only a clear, quiet certainty, the kind my father had shown me his whole life without ever needing to explain it. Those aren't the same thing, Linda. She didn't answer. She couldn't, I think. There wasn't an answer that would have made either of us feel any better, and we both seemed to understand that at the same moment. I drove her home in silence. I helped carry nothing inside, said nothing more about the house, the trust, the folder full of 40 years of quiet generosity she had never known to be grateful for. I simply pulled into the driveway, put the truck in park, and sat there for a moment before speaking again. I'm going back out to Dad's place tonight, I said. I think I'm going to be staying there a while. She looked at me, eyes red, some last flicker of hope still visible in her face, as if she believed a sentence like that could still be undone with enough apologizing. How long is a while? I don't know yet. I said, and I meant it honestly, without cruelty, without any desire to punish her further than the truth already had. Long enough to figure some things out, I think. She got out of the truck slowly, and I watched her walk up the front steps of the house my father had quietly helped us buy. 31 years ago, watched her pause at the door, hand on the frame, not looking back. I didn't feel the satisfaction I might have expected. I didn't feel vindicated or victorious or even particularly angry anymore. I felt something quieter than all of that. The strange, settled peace of a man who has finally stopped carrying a weight he never should have picked up in the first place. I put the truck back in gear and drove the 11 miles out to the farmhouse, back toward the man who had spent 93 years teaching me, without ever once raising his voice, exactly what strength was supposed to look like. Several months have passed since that morning in the workshop, when my phone buzzed itself nearly off the workbench. Linda and I are divorced now, quietly, without the courtroom drama people sometimes imagine when a marriage ends after 31 years. There was nothing left to fight over in the end. The truth had already settled everything that needed settling. I moved into the farmhouse permanently that fall, into the same small bedroom I grew up in, though my father insisted on renovating the back of the house into something more like an apartment of my own. A kitchenette, a proper bathroom, a window that looks out over the fields where he used to watch my mother hang laundry on Saturday mornings. He hired the contractors himself, walked the site every day with his cane, correcting measurements the same way he always has, still unwilling to trust a house he hasn't inspected with his own eyes. He's steadier now than he was that day on the bathroom floor, though. Age doesn't reverse itself, and we both know there will be harder days ahead eventually. But for now, in this particular autumn, he moves through his mornings with the same quiet purpose he's always had: coffee on the porch. The newspaper he still won't read online. Small chores around a house that has, after everything, remained entirely his own. The rocking chair sits finished now out on that same porch, its curves smooth beneath 4 months of careful sanding and 2 coats of oil I rubbed in by hand the way he taught me. He sits in it most evenings when the weather allows, and some nights I sit beside him in the chair I built years ago for myself, and neither of us says very much at all. We don't need to. Last evening, as the sun dropped low over the fields, painting the barn gold, and then rust, and then a deep, settling blue, He reached over and rested his hand on the arm of that rocking chair, tracing the grain, the same way I had once traced it with sandpaper. "You did good work here, son," he said. I didn't answer right away. I just watched the light fade, watched him rock slowly, peacefully, a man who had spent 93 years teaching me that strength isn't raising your voice. It's knowing when silence speaks louder. If this story reminded you of someone who always put their family first, someone who worked their whole life, never complained, and deserved kindness instead of neglect, I hope you'll take a moment to honor them. This one's for every father and grandfather whose quiet sacrifices so often go unnoticed, the ones who carry their falls alone rather than trouble the people they love. And if you're lucky enough to still have your parents with you, don't wait for someday. Pick up the phone, make the drive. Tell them what they mean to you while you still can. I'd love to hear from you. What would you have done if you'd been standing in that hallway in Michael's place? Share your thoughts below. I read as many as I can, and your story might be exactly what reminds someone else that compassion still matters. And if this touched you, pass it along to someone who believes that family isn't measured by words, but by the choices we make when the people we love need us most.